So with the brand new and, let's be honest, stunning Kill Team going up for pre-order next weekend, which gets you both the Striking Scorpions as well as the incredibly useful, very cool looking new Space Marine Scouts, I thought it might be fun to take a look at the rules for these stealthy melee specialists of the Aeldari and see if they are likely to find a spot in your lists when these new models do drop. Now, Scorpions are currently not really in the meta of most Aeldari lists. We tend to more often see things like Fire Dragons, Warp Spiders, and Swooping Hawks when we do see Aspect Warriors in competitive lists. But as with anything Aeldari, there is sometimes a case that even the bad units in their book are actually still not bad generally and would be pretty decent picks in other armies' books. They're just overshadowed by the Aeldari having generally better stuff all around. So let's take a look at these Scorpions and see if the new models might persuade you to actually drag them back onto the battlefield. So first up, Striking Scorpions are relatively cheap. They are just 15 points per model, and that gets you a minimum squad of 5, so you get 5 of them for 75 points. That immediately makes them a little bit cheaper than some of the other Aspect Warriors, Fire Dragons, Warp Spiders, even Howling Banshees, which are sort of their main melee competition, are all a little bit pricier than them. And for that 15 points, you get a 1 wound toughness 3 model with a 3-up save and a 5-up invuln. So yes, they are squishy, they won't last long out in the open, or if the enemy gets a good solid few rounds of shooting into them. But to help with that, they do have Infiltrate, which will help them get up the board and onto objectives and just wherever you need them to be very, very quickly. And then on top of that, they also have a 7-inch move, which is very, very nice and means they can quite feasibly get a turn 1 charge off potentially, and they will almost guarantee to be getting a turn 2 at the latest. So they can reach combat really very fast, and that's exactly where you want them to be so that they can A, kill your opponent, but also protect them from your enemy's shooting. Striking Scorpions are less of an elite killer like Howling Banshees, they are more of a chaff and horde killing unit. Their basic loadout of Shuriken Pistol for some token shooting and Scorpion Chainsword gives them 4 attacks with sustained hits 1 at strength 4, no AP and 1 damage each in melee. So that doesn't sound super terrifying, I will admit, although I will say against something that is their intended target like Guardsmen, that will on average net you around 7 or 8 dead Guardsmen from just a squad of 5 of these, so they can really chew through that low toughness, poor save infantry very, very well. And then their Exarch can pump that up a bit more. He can either take a Scorpion Claw, which adds some extra strength 8 minus 2 AP 2 damage attacks to the mix, 4 to be precise, and again having sustained hits, or instead of that 5 extra attacks at strength 5 minus 1 AP and 2 damage. So either of those weapons will really help you to cut through things that are a bit more elite, things like Marines a lot more effectively, but they are still, I would say, a far cry from something like the Howling Banshees, who have a whopping minus 3 AP on all of their swords to help them chew through power armor. However, the Scorpions do have a hidden trick up their sleeve, and what that is their war gear, which is their Mandiblasters. And what these do is that their melee attacks have the devastating wounds rule against anything that isn't a monster or a vehicle. So that 0 AP attack that you thought was really rubbish before, that can now potentially be ignoring Terminator's 2-up armor and a 4-up invulnerable save. So that does add a lot of potential output to them, especially when you factor in things like the Strands of Fate dice to get those guaranteed 6s, or the unparalleled foresight detachment rule to allow you to re-roll some of those wounds to fish for those 6s. In essence, the Mandiblasters ability means that 5 Scorpions with 20 attacks, just having chainswords on all of them, go from doing around 2.7 wounds to nearly 5 wounds on a 3-up save Marine profile. So that one rule alone almost doubles their output into Marines. And of course, with things like the Biting Blade or the Scorpion's Claw, that just gets even more powerful into more elite enemies. I think for just 15 points per model, that isn't at all shabby. And whilst I think they are obviously much, much better at cleaving through toughness 3 bodies with a 4 or a 5 up save, things like infantry squads or fire warriors or Aeldari guardians or Tyrannid gaunts, they can still do reasonably well purely thanks to their Mandiblasters into tougher units that you would maybe otherwise think that 0 AP is just going to make them absolutely rubbish into. In general, Scorpions just make great little cheap units for nabbing objectives. Infiltrating them into cover on an objective really does mean it's going to be quite difficult for your opponent to get rid of them, and they can just be a thorn in your opponent's side, especially if your opponent was hoping to go after an objective with some cheap chaff units of their own, because in terms of fighting off other chaff units, Scorpions will pretty much beat almost any other like chaff level unit in the game at the moment. They are very, very good and efficient at fighting off those kind of units in particular. So they can be a really nice, easy, cheap little unit to add in just to go after, infiltrate and grab a couple of random objectives around the battlefield. However, alternatively, if you wanted to really go all in on them, a 10-man squad with their Phoenix Lord Karandras, who is 100 points himself, will net you a 250 point squad with 15 wounds, infiltrate, a 5-up invuln, and whilst the Scorpions can of course decimate light infantry exceptionally well, Karandras himself brings a much, much meaner anti-elite or anti-horde profile to the mix. Not only does he innately buff the unit with +1 to hit thanks to Shadowhunter, which is a superb buff for the Scorpions and can easily mean with sustained hits you get more hits than you actually have attacks, but then on top of that, Karandras gets critical hits on a 4+ the turn he's charged, so he himself can get even more sustained hits from his melee weapons, both of which have the sustained hits rule. He has got a 2-up save and a 4-up invuln, so he is a bit more tanky against things like precision fire, and as I mentioned just now, he does bring some hugely potent extra melee output to his squad. First up, his Scorpion's Bite War Gear means that his melee weapons get those same devastating wounds as the Scorpions with Mandiblasters, but this time this is against anything that isn't Titanic, so this does also proc against monsters and vehicles, and that makes him really, really nice because he has 2 weapons to choose from, Ara's Bane and Isimethil, both of which are tailor-made for either killing elites or killing chaff. Ara's Bane is strength 8, -3 AP and 2 damage with 5 attacks, so this thing alone in a squad on the charge will let him kill around 5 marines outright by himself, which is incredibly good, and even into things like Terminators, he will still on average kill about 2 of them. On the other hand, if you are charging him and your Scorpions into a big squad of say Orc Boys, Isimethil is instead 8 attacks, and these are strength 6, -1 AP and 1 damage. So this will, again on the charge, let Karandras slaughter about 7 Orc Boys in a single go, whilst the rest of your Scorpion squad easily mops up the rest with their chainswords. So he is just incredibly good at wiping out Marines, Terminators, Orc Boys, Guardsmen, and even against vehicles, especially light vehicles. Thanks to the Scorpion's Bite, he can actually do some damage, and using Ara's Bane, he will do on average around 6 damage to something like a Rhino, so he's not going to be one-shotting it, but he can certainly help to soften it up or kill it off if it's taken a bit of damage, especially with the backup attacks from the rest of his Scorpions. The problem with him is that he is 100 points, and whilst I think he is okay for 100 points, it does make a very, very expensive squad at 250 points, and whilst I think if you are bringing Scorpions, I would say Karandras is a good pick to bring just to add a bit more damage output to them. The Scorpions themselves, they're okay. They're reasonably cheap for the damage they can do, and for having infiltrate, it does mean you can go and score objectives relatively well with them. But I just think they're almost not worth taking because the Aeldari forces have got so much fast moving stuff anyway. The infiltrate is very useful, don't get me wrong, but if you want an objective quite far away on the board, chances are you're going to have some jet bikes or, you know, an autarch with wings that can fly, or a Farseer on a jet bike or something that can go and grab it easily enough anyway. And I think things like the detachment rule, unparalleled foresight, whilst yes it can help you fish for more damage, when you have a unit that is relying on weight of attacks, that one reroll isn't quite as useful as it would be on, say, something like a Fire Prism or a Wraith Knight. So again, if you are taking Scorpions and you bring Karandras, that one reroll really will benefit more because you can use it on him and get some really good damage from things like Ara's Bane. But just on a squad of 5 or even 10 Scorpions, it's one of those things that's nice to have, but it's not the best detachment rule to benefit them really. I think maybe in their eventual codex, when they get some more detachments, if there are some that grant some extra buffs to the aspects specifically, and I think in historical books, Biel-Tan is generally the craft world that gives the buffs to the aspects. There have been things in previous editions where aspects have got extra movement to get into combat quicker, or strats to give them exploding sixes. I mean, I know Scorpions already have that now with sustained hits, but some kind of detachment rule just to make them perform better compared to having unparalleled foresight could make them see the board a bit more. But as it stands right now, I don't think striking Scorpions are terrible, and if you love the new models, and to be fair, the new models are very, very cool, you can absolutely find a place for these guys at 15 points per model, infiltrate them up, grab some objectives, just be an annoying thorn in your opponent's side that they kind of have to shoot off, or at least send something vaguely good in combat to get rid of, because if they just send guardsmen or chaff or other like weak little objective grabbing units, they're probably just going to die against the Scorpions. So that could be a worthy 75 point investment. I just think that, as we see in most tournament lists, things like your Warp Spiders and your Swooping Hawks get you that extra level of mobility anyway. They also bring some really nice ranged potential, which makes them more useful than the melee only Scorpions. And then you also have things like Fire Dragons for that dedicated anti-tank that you really do need to help pop vehicles in 10th edition. And for me, that just leaves the Scorpions, unfortunately, just a little bit out of place. I don't think the Aeldari in general struggle to take out infantry, whether it's chaff, hordes, or more elite. They have a lot of ways to do that. So having an aspect unit that is purely aimed at taking out light infantry and hordes and chaff isn't something that you are really looking for when you're building an army. And I think whilst in most situations with the Aeldari Codex you would look at a marine unit and then look at the equivalent Aeldari one to see how much better it is, if you do that the other way round and compare the Scorpions to something like Space Marine Assault Intercessors, the Marine Assault Intercessors are 1 point more, they lose out on the 5-up invuln and an inch of movement and devastating wounds in melee, but instead they gain a pip of armor on their melee attacks all the time, which is nice. They get to reroll wound rolls of 1 and all wound rolls near an objective, and then of course they get that incredibly useful second wound. So I just think Scorpions are a bit too flimsy to survive the whole game, and even with Fate Dice and unparalleled foresight, they just don't quite dish out the levels of damage that you need them to unless you are up against a very specific target like Guardsmen. So that is the striking Scorpions. Unfortunately, they are just a bit far from being a good, solid unit at the moment, but they do look awesome, they do look cool, they are getting some brand spanking new models, and I think if you do really want to use them, you certainly can find places for them if you kind of work your list around them a little bit. But, as always, I'd love to know your thoughts on them. Are they better than I'm giving them credit for, and would you take them over something like Assault Intercessors if you were a Marine player? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and as always, thank you very much for watching. Please do like and subscribe for more Warhammer content from me, but until next time, I'll catch you later guys.